All right, everybody, welcome here to show 175 on Crypto Voices. Matthew here, coming at you from the Baltics, as always, joined by my co-host Alec Harris from the eastern U.S. Is it getting cold there, Alec? Because it is here.
It is. 175 is kind of auspicious. It's sort of like a mini milestone.
Yes, it is. It is.
That's what I would like to say to start the day.
Good. And yeah, I think we're going to have to actually be doing some quarterly updates with our guest here, Tim Starr, because it was great feedback from the last one. He went on some other shows as well, which I've really enjoyed, and we'll direct our listeners to that. But Libertarian, Tim? Historian, philosopher, scholar, autodidact, author at Liberpedia. And I think with all the crazy things going on in the world, basically, to finish up the intro, since we last spoke, there's been 2 assassination attempts on the president. The upper echelons of Hezbollah and Hamas have been eliminated. It's been some pretty crazy times, worldwide. And of course, we have Ukraine. Oh, Ukraine, of course, invaded. There's a special military operation of Ukraine into Russia, which is very exciting for us over here on the Eastern Front. But it's been a pretty wild ride the last, since we last spoke a couple months ago. So welcome back. And thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our first one, and also we'll direct our listeners to it was the Politically Homeless podcast. The host there, very good in history as well. It's interesting to hear you guys sort of riff off of each other's reading and just talking about national defense and stuff, which, Alec and I, we've done more and more of these episodes, and I think it's obviously timely with an election coming up. But just to get started, we talked a little bit pre-show about what we talk about. Let's do a current roundup of the useful idiots in American media and politics here. We have from Jill Stein to Dave Rubin and Tim Pool and others. It just seems like you cannot deny that Russia is influencing U.S. elections. Of course, we've had this much stated in the past in the Mueller report and stuff. Of course, they don't say there's collusion. They do show all the players that are interfering. There's no collusion, but we have a lot of interference in elections. And I guess the first thing I want to start out with is, what do you say to the non-interventionist libertarians that their just knee-jerk reaction to all of this always is, it's America's fault. This is blowback. This is because of the Iraq War. This is because of the Vietnam War. How should we view this sort of the tenet media fallout here, where millions of dollars were getting paid for these right-wing conservatives? Jill Stein saying that she won't condemn Putin. It's obvious she's in the pocket of Russia as well. Is it just always America's fault here? Or what should we say about the current state of political affairs in the U.S.?
I think the biggest question I would be asking myself, if someone were to out of the blue come to me and offer me $100,000 a week to do a podcast on these topics, is why me? What is it that makes me so unique and special and qualified for this? I've never made that much money before in my life. It would be awfully nice to make that much money. At various times in my life, I've actually been accused of being on the Koch brothers' payroll, although I'm quite sure they wouldn't have me if I applied. And I would be asking myself, what is it that makes me, have this special insight into things that would, make me deserve that much money from somebody? Do I speak the languages of the places I'm talking about, like Arabic or Russian or some other East European language? Do I have degrees in that area? I actually have read a lot of books, but I'm not the only one in the world that's read a lot of books. I think these are questions that these people don't seem to ask themselves. They don't look the gift horse in the mouth. They just go, "Hey, that's awesome! Wow, this podcast YouTube channel gig is a hell of a lot more lucrative than I ever imagined it could be, and this is great." And then a little while later, these new financial benefactors start telling them, hey, we really want you to talk about this. And I have worked in business enough at high-tech startups to know that when your biggest customers start telling you what they want, you start doing what they want. For instance, one of the companies I worked for, we got a big new client that we poached from another company, and they told us, well, we really like this person that we worked with at the old company, so we want you to hire her. And we did. And she was good, and I liked working with her. But that's the kind of leverage that comes with being a big revenue source. What's the saying? He who pays the piper calls the tune. And I think you'd really want to start asking yourself, why am I hitting these themes that seem to be favoring a certain side of this dispute, over and over again repeatedly? And, with the Tenet Media case, we even saw some discussion from them. I think it was the one where their paymasters wanted them to talk about and show the clip of Tucker Carlson visiting a grocery store in Moscow and going, oh my gosh, this is great. The prices are so cheap. They have such a great selection. And they're like, this seems like a bit much. This is kind of like we're shilling for Russia. And their paymaster said, we don't care. We want you to show it anyway. And they did.
Yep.
That's the kind of thing where if even your own conscience is bothering you, you really should pay attention to it.
Yeah. And it's almost like at this point, there's a certain level of cognitive dissonance, I think, or, just the scales just have not dropped from the eyes of a lot of the, of course, this is very broad. We can paint broad strokes and say this is the right wing Trump supporters. I don't think you would agree that it's all of them, but it's a certain huge faction of them that are doing this. And I'm trying to wonder, at what point do people just say that they're tired of all of the bluster and the obfuscating and just sort of go to the Occam's razor of it all and say, yeah, there actually are other players in the world that might not have our best interest, and we need to increase our national defense. We need to increase our spending on certain things. We need to support our allies around the world. Of course, it's not that easy when you get into the real politique of it all. They were probably arguing about this stuff during the Vietnam War. I'm getting that back, of course, to the non-interventionist views, which are libertarian friends. And I myself, probably until 2014, was mostly espousing. They just sort of refuse to believe that there are actually actors out there that aren't aligned with Western values or classical liberal values.
Yeah, I bought it until 2001, September 11th, 2001. But I had already sort of started on the path to learning better. And when I started hearing people saying things that were just completely factually wrong as a description of what happened over there, I mean, I used to argue gun rights with people a lot online. And, the only reason I don't now is that my views haven't changed, but I have less opposition, which is fine with me. But I remember arguing with people who were saying the reason why the Taliban came to power is because everyone had guns. And I went, no, one of the first things they did was ban gun ownership for everybody except the Taliban. That's another thing that I think we need to watch out for is when we start seeing these wildly false descriptions of the facts on the ground in other countries. And for instance, I remember, Saddam Hussein made a show before we invaded of, handing out some AK-47s, and all of a sudden, all the paleo libertarians were running around saying, wow, that's great. I wish I was an Iraqi. I'm like, no, you really don't. And he's not letting everybody have guns, especially his opposition. You're nuts. Going back to the question of, are there other actors out there in the world? I think there's this very common view we may have talked about before that, the United States is the only sort of prime mover in international affairs, and everyone else is just reacting to us. We're the cue ball on the billiard table of the world, and every other ball just responds if we hit them. And if any of those balls do anything we don't want them to, well, we shouldn't have hit them.
Right.
This just ignores the fact that there's everyone has free will. Every leader of a country has free will. They are more or less constrained by the wishes of their people, depending on the system they're in. They may or may not do things completely on their own. And the other thing that this sort of outlook always ignores is a lot of the things that the United States does are reactions to what other countries do. And that somehow never gets taken into account. That's one that always amazes me. Is that, the Khmer Rouge implemented, mass murder and, total obliteration of the previous society because America bombed them. Well, what did they do to make us bomb them? Anything? Apparently not. Apparently there's nothing in the world that any other country could do that would make us bomb them or do anything else bad to them.
During the show, I do want to spend some time steelmanning a lot of these critiques that people have of U.S. foreign policy, which I think that you have a very good view on. But before we get to that, one more thing about the media, which I wanted to ask you about, which I think is just so obvious, is you have these foreign actors, let's just call them, whether they're from China or from Russia, that are outright just blasé with their positions on U.S. media. And of course, RT was the big one for 10 years. And, ever since Ukraine happened the first time in 2014 is where, fully, it was already in my blood. But, like I said, the scales dropped from my eyes about how this stuff really works. But this has been going on for a long time, festering in this sort of right wing, just stewing. And people seem to still not understand that for all the chat show bickering and the arguing about what's happening, all of this stuff is happening on a free and open Western media platforms, where if you went on those same platforms in Russia or in China, you wouldn't find any of this. They're completely banned, completely blacklisted. There's just a complete dark out of the kind of information that you are exposed to in the West. And I think we've, it's been evident in Ukraine. This is a common. This is just the most common thing that you'll hear from Ukrainians that have relatives in Russia, because Vladimir Putin started to nationalize the private channels the moment that he got in the year 2000, and that's like since 2000, Russia has been on this path of state media just guiding the way of the populist groupthink. And you will hear that still to this day. That the Russian relatives of Ukrainians, they just can't believe that there are these atrocities being committed by Russians in Ukraine. And of course, they're not going to see the amazing things that the Ukrainians are doing for some of these Russians, buying them medicine and whatnot in Kursk. And indeed, fog of war, there's some propaganda victories for Ukraine there. But regardless, go back to the bigger point about Western platforms are just free and open, and these platforms are not open in these countries where our right-wing friends, those regimes that they really want to coddle up to for some reason. So what do you say about that? What is a liberal society supposed to do about this stuff? Are we supposed to ban some channels, or are we supposed to let everything go? How do you view that sort of situation?
Well, it's certainly true that there is a completely one-sided difference in the amount of censorship that we have here in the West and the amount that they have in, say, Russia. For instance, I was just telling somebody yesterday who's denying that Russia's a dictatorship that you can get arrested for holding up a blank sheet of paper in Red Square. And people have.
Yep. Yep.
If you're an opposition journalist over there, you can be murdered for it. Anna Politkovskaya was. She was a critic of how Putin was running his war in Chechnya.
Yep.
If you're an opposition politician over there, you can be murdered. Boris Berezovsky was murdered. within sight of Red Square, one of the most heavily surveilled places in the world. And supposedly Putin knew nothing about it. Politkovskaya was killed on Putin's birthday. That sounds like one hell of a birthday present. If I could be dictator for a day, which, nobody should ever let me do, there are a few people I'd like to have killed on my birthday. As for what we should do here in the West, this is one area where I think, the people that are supposedly so much more concerned about our domestic politics than they are about the rest of the world seem to have a bit of a blind spot. Specifically, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution establishes freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and it says that, Congress shall make no law abridging that, which is great. But the principle underlying that, I would say, is that we don't want government telling us what we can say and what we can hear. But I don't understand why we seem to only apply that to our own government. If we have state-sponsored media operations trying to flood the zone, so to speak, with their preferred narrative, do we have to allow that? I don't think we do. I don't think that's required by freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is for, people, private actors, private parties, to tell us what they think. And, if they happen to honestly believe in something that's said by some other, foreign government that's hostile, that's fine. But if they're on the payroll of that foreign government and their job is specifically to tell us these things, how come those governments don't have their own official spokespeople and ambassadors to convey their point of view? They do. Similarly, if we have countries that, have a single religion allowed in their country and it is government sponsored, do we have to allow that country to also sponsor that same religion and those religious institutions over here in our own countries? I don't think we necessarily do. I don't think it's, an absolute must for us to restrict them. I think it's, a matter of prudence for us to decide.
How much responsibility do you think the listener, viewer, reader bears to be skeptical, to be a sophisticated consumer of media, to be looking for narratives that might have been sponsored, planted, right? Because anyone who, if you take the Tenet Media story, right, like it was not difficult to identify pro-Russian narratives in any of those podcasters, right? Like that was fairly simple. And the fact that they maybe didn't know that this money was coming from Russia, like as the case alleges, whatever, but it wouldn't have been hard to figure it out. So a lot of people just listen and subscribe and follow, though. So where is our responsibility?
Well, I do ultimately think that's what it really comes down to, because, I don't believe it's possible for us to simply expect that, the authorities in whatever country we live in are going to take care of this for us and relieve us of that responsibility. I think that's unrealistic and, a bit of a fantasy. The thing, I don't know, I guess the take I would have on the whole topic of, the buyer beware, don't believe everything you hear on the internet line is that I would like to see people practice it more. I see a whole lot of gullibility out there with people who, don't really know anything about the topics they're, sharing their opinions about. They haven't, they all love to say, do your research. They don't do their research, by and large. And I know why. It's time consuming. It's hard work. I think there's this tendency to try to either derive empirical facts from pure theory or, use pure theory to filter out contrary facts. And I think we need to have more of an attitude of requiring that your theories be consistent with the facts. If the facts conflict with your theory, you can't just try to explain them away. You have to change your theory. And I think there's a lot of resistance there. It's a lot easier to learn a theory than it is to learn the facts.
Yes. And I wonder, does consumption of media and do your own research fall more in the category of like, there's certain things that where do your own research doesn't typically apply. Like, you get advice from your doctor. People don't usually say, well, go do your own research, right? Well, I don't have a medical degree. Now you could, right? Like it's not a bad idea to double check some stuff, right? But, I don't know how much like GPT medical school advice I want to take yet. Maybe soon, right? But when it comes to media, it's like I'm inundated with channels, across social media and written media and traditional media and all over. And I'm a pretty thoughtful consumer of media, I would say, and I still have a very hard time of bifurcating truth and sometimes it's easy. Like Tucker Carlson makes it easy because he goes and gets an interview with Putin and then does a tour of the prettiest subway station he's ever seen, right? Like that wasn't a hard one, but sometimes it's pretty subtle. And so where do we look for integrity in this space?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think what I would do is I would advocate that there's basically two versions of how to find out the truth. One version is that you need to find the right sources or authorities, and then whatever they say, take it on faith that that's the truth. I call that authoritarian epistemology. There's probably other names for it. The other version would be try to figure out which theories predict results that come true in the real world. And this is what Einstein did when he advocated his theory of relativity. I can't remember the exact experiment right now, but he made a prediction about what would prove his theory false. And that's something that I don't really see people looking out for a lot. There's a lot of confirmation bias out there where, people only look for evidence that is consistent with their theories. They don't look for evidence that is contrary to their theories. And even if you present them with evidence that is contrary to their theories, oftentimes they will try to find a way to make it consistent with their theory. And I think you have to be just more honest with yourself about these types of things and say, either, this theory predicted a certain result and that result did not happen. For instance, in financial affairs, I heard a joke once that libertarians predicted 20 out of the last financial crises. I used to hear people predicting doom and gloom about the U.S. dollar, the U.S. economy all the time, and it almost never happened. Then in 2007, it finally did happen. So I think there are people that deserve credit for making that particular prediction, but all those other predictions did not come true. And I think you have to, be more skeptical about those. The other thing is, I think that part of being honest with yourself about this type of thing is being willing to admit when you don't know. And that's something I honestly just don't see a whole lot of these days on any side of any debate, is people saying, I don't know the answer. Or people saying, I've got to think about that. I've got to study up on that. I've got to read up on that. That's one thing that occurs to me when I see a lot of people on talk shows who just talk nonstop. They never shut up. They always seem to know what to say. They always have some patter that they go into. Are they really stopping to think about what they're saying? Are they ever stumped? I wonder about that.
Yeah, we had a show last week. We were just talking about how noise is news for sure, and the noisier you are, just seems to get more clicks, and that's where it goes. But well, let's move on. I mean, let's move a little bit deeper, I guess, because I wanna challenge you as always. You have good research, and I just want to try to poke on a few of at least some of the claims that the people that usually are saying that the U.S. is doing a bad job, and see how that compares to maybe some of our adversaries. Middle East maybe first. So I mentioned this book to you. It was actually, I thought it was an interesting read. It's by Daniel Dennett's sister. It's called Follow the Pipelines. Daniel Dennett, obviously one of the Four Horsemen with Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, and who's the fourth? Can't remember now off the top of my head. But anyway,
you're talking about the New Atheists.
New Atheists.
Yeah, and I was a big fan of Christopher Hitchens. I'm really sorry that he's gone.
Yeah, and his views are quite a bit different than his brother. It seems like, from what he's been espousing lately. But nonetheless, it was Richard Dawkins was the fourth, of course. This was the
right.
Four Horsemen. So Daniel Dennett's sister wrote this very interesting book, in my opinion, and it's it has this perspective of why is the U.S. in the Middle East? Perhaps we can trace it to the oil. It's going to have that bent, but her story is interwoven with her family story of trying to find more about her father and her father's death. And her father was in the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. Apparently, the first star on the wall in Langley is for him. That was a claim made in the book. And, it's just interesting. But one of the challenges to the sort of the Leviathan state and the security state of the U.S. is that, it's been a long time since that. This was like the 1940s when her father died. And this stuff is still kept top secret in the interest of national security. And obviously we know there's more famous cases such as Kennedy and down the line. But I guess firstly, just want to start, with this sort of broad overview of the Middle East. There's claims, the simple ones, that, the British drew the lines on the map there, and then the French, and then the Americans came in, and it's just colonialism all the way down. How do you look at that situation when people, and then of course that leads to all the problems to today. How do you look at that situation from that lens?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I have to thank you guys for is motivating me to finally read a book that's been on my reading list for about 20 years, which is A Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, which is all about the demise of the Ottoman Empire in World War I and how that got divvied up by Britain and France, and the extent to which the United States was involved over there at the same time. It was very interesting. And I certainly think that oil was one of the motives for that. But interestingly, at the time, there was some oil exploration being done. Standard Oil was involved in what is now Turkey. They thought there was going to be oil in what is now Iraq, around Mosul, because the oil was basically seeping up out of the ground around there. But there was no existing oil extraction operation there. It was all purely exploratory at the time. And then there had also been some, let's say, maneuvering by Britain and Russia over the oil fields in northern Iran also, even though that was not part of the Ottoman Empire. But there was a big debate about, how involved Russia was going to be in Iran, whether or not Britain would be able to get in on that as well. But I don't really think oil was the primary driver over there. I think the two factors were, going back to earlier in the 19th century, most of the European countries wanted to contain Russia. That was why they supported the Ottoman Empire, actually, in the Crimean War, is because the Ottoman Empire was seen as a buffer against Russian expansionism in that region. And then The other big factor driving involvement there was the British Empire wanted to secure its shipping route to India through the Suez Canal. So Britain was, let's say, occupying Egypt. It wasn't like I think a literal colony. I can't remember exactly what the arrangement was, but basically the Brits were running Egypt. And, the Suez Canal got built, I believe, by the French. The Brits wanted to make sure they had secure access to that canal because they needed it to get to and from India by sea. The other big concern was that the land route to India went through the Middle East. That it used to be the Silk Road or the Silk routes way back when, and all that land route still existed. One of the interesting factoids I got from this book of Fromkin's about the Ottoman Empire was that they didn't get railroads until shortly before World War I, and that cut their transportation costs over land to the east by a factor of about 90%. Before that, they were still doing transport with camel caravans. Because camel caravans turned out to be a very good way to do things, to do that kind of transport over there until the advent of railroads. So that was a big factor when the Ottoman Empire basically lost World War I and got broken up. I think the Brits basically wanted to make sure they had control of the canal on both sides, and then they seemed to try to get the French to come in to be a replacement for the Ottoman Empire as a buffer state between them and Russia. And, that was a real big deal for the Brits. You got to remember, the British Empire was still going strong. It actually peaked in between World War I and World War II as far as its amount of geographic territory that it controlled.
Yep.
And, they still had colonies in Africa. They had India. They obviously still had Australia. They wanted to make sure they had the best, easiest possible access by sea to all of those places. Another big factor that was involved, I think more for Americans in the Ottoman Empire, was Christian missionaries were over there from America trying to, evangelize to the people over there. The people they ended up focusing on the most were the Armenians, the Orthodox Christians of the Ottoman Empire, because they were already Christian mainly, and the Muslims were less interested in Christianity. They basically said, no thanks, we've already got the religion we want. But that was a big deal over there. In fact, to an extent, for a while, Standard Oil's operations in the Ottoman Empire ended up basically acting as a financial conduit during the war between the missionaries and their supporters back here in America. And Standard Oil sort of ended up doing the same sort of activities as a financial intermediary for other people during the war that wanted to be able to get money in or out of the country also.
Taking a moment to remind you that this show is brought to you by Trezor, home of the original Bitcoin hardware wallet. For over 10 years now, Trezor means business in Bitcoin security and functionality. When using their wallet software Trezor Suite to connect to the Bitcoin network, you're automatically connected via Tor, protecting your identity and giving you full control of your coins in a fully open source manner, both on the software level and on the hardware level. So head on over to Trezor.io to grab your brand new Trezor Safe 5 with a secure element, as well as a ton of available accessories to back up your keys and keep your coins safe.
Another point I think is worth making about the interest in oil, around the world, which is that oil was a superior alternative to fueling ships to coal, which was the predecessor. But one of the things about coal is that a lot of the European powers that got colonies overseas did so primarily so they would have places to store coal for their ships. They were called coaling stations. And with the transition to oil, they didn't need those places as much. They didn't need as many of them. And that's one of the things that I think ultimately ended up weakening the hold or the demand for imperialism by those European powers.
We don't have to do the whole history on the podcast, but I do think, obviously we can bring in other players now. And if we fast forward to the 70s, we have, of course, this is when really the petrodollar kicks up, and Kissinger was famously involved in helping with that and deals with Saudi Arabia. But even as this was going on, there's, of course, Russia is interested in this area. And one of the interesting things I mentioned to you on the show, I think it's funny, is I sent you even some quotes from Kissinger's obituary. One of the interesting things that is always sort of mentioned about him, I've heard Ferguson mention it as well, his biographer, is that Kissinger kind of kept the Russians at bay as far as it goes in the Middle East. But really, one has to sort of suspend their understanding of Russians' involvement in Afghanistan and other areas. I mean, they certainly were involved in the Middle East this whole time, but it's sort of a credit, I don't know, to Kissinger in that he sort of kept the Russians out of the Middle East, which maybe is just a false credit, or I'm misunderstanding the way that people put that. But it was even in his obituary. He said that, I showed you that quote where they said, Russians weren't, he kept the Russians out of the Middle East all the way until the Syrian war in 2015. And obviously this author forgot about Afghanistan when the Russians were there,
and a whole lot more. That when I saw that, I was really mystified about how anyone could say that. So
do elaborate on that part, because I think it's important to bring up other interests in the region, and then of course how maybe the relationships goes with the Saudis during all this time.
Yes, right, exactly, sure. So I think a good place to start on that is there was this defector from Romania's intelligence service named Pacepa. That's his last name. I don't really know how to speak Romanian, so I can't really pronounce his first name. But at any rate, Pacepa was the head of Romania's intelligence service. Romania was allied with the Soviet Union, so Pacepa was the person who directly met with Andropov, who was the head of the Soviet KGB, obviously. And he was also the official liaison with Yasser Arafat of the PLO. And what Pacepa says basically is that Andropov told him that the Soviets were going to use Libya and Iraq, so Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, as their primary, lead countries in the Middle East, because they both had a lot of oil, so they could afford to spend a lot of money. And the Soviets sold them both a lot of weapons. I think by 1991, 66% of Saddam's weapons had been bought from the Soviet Union. I don't know what the number is for Gaddafi, but I'm sure it was something similar. And they also spent a lot of that money training terrorists. The PLO, the PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Abu Nidal organization, also the German terrorist group known as either the Baader-Meinhof Gang or their official name was the Red Army Fraction, but most people called them the Baader-Meinhof Gang because those were the names of its founders. They spent some time over in Libya also. So did the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And then let's not forget, Egypt was probably the most successful case of the Soviets backing off a bit in response to Kissinger's diplomacy during and after the Yom Kippur War in 1973. But even there, I think the extent to which Egypt stopped being involved with the Soviet Union is greatly exaggerated. They still had a lot of Soviet military hardware that needed maintenance and parts, and they needed training on it. All of that continued. They kept getting more, I read a memoir by a U.S. military officer, Colonel David Hackworth, who left during the Vietnam War and became a critic of the Vietnam War because he thought it was not being fought well. And he ended up becoming a journalist, and he went to the Middle East right before the Gulf War, and he said how he thought it was really weird to him to be surrounded by all of this Soviet-made equipment in the hands of the Egyptians and the Syrians right before the Gulf War, because he had spent his entire career preparing himself to fight the people who were operating that equipment, and suddenly they were on our side, supposedly. The other thing is, Syria never stopped being first a Soviet client and then a Russian client. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a pretty smooth transition of all of these Soviet clients to Russia. There wasn't even really a handoff, just the organizations that were involved in running them, had a name change at best. Soviet military intelligence never even bothered to change their name. The KGB changed its names to the FSB and the SVR. And you got to realize that these leaders of these countries were very subservient to the Soviets and then the Russians. I read a quote about Saddam saying that at one point, the KGB didn't even bother having its own office space in Baghdad. Just whenever they needed an office, they would, order some Iraqi intelligence guy out of his office so they could use it. And, away they went. This is consistent with how, we have testimony from defectors elsewhere from Central America and their relationship with the Cuban intelligence services. I believe it was in Nicaragua. They basically said that when the Cubans came to town, they obeyed the orders of the Cuban intelligence people. And then it was the same thing for the Cubans and the KGB. So these are countries that are ruled by their secret police, and they have a very real and binding chain of command going back to Moscow, going back to the Kremlin. That's whose orders they follow. So saying that Kissinger got the Soviets out of the Middle East, I asked myself, what part and how exactly did they get out? And also to me, that would suggest that things were somehow getting better for our allies over there. And in a lot of ways, they weren't. So, for instance, in the Yom Kippur War, Israel was only able to survive that thanks to the fact that it could still get oil from Iran. That was its main oil supplier at the time, 1973. And we were able to airlift supplies to them via the Azores, those are Portugal's islands in the Atlantic. Well, shortly after that, the dictator of Portugal, Salazar, died, and there was a revolution in Portugal. Portugal got taken over by a left-wing regime that decided to give its colonies independence. And all of a sudden, after that, there was no way that Portugal was ever going to allow us to use their bases in the Azores to fly supplies to Israel. And then by the end of the 70s, there was the Iranian Revolution, in which a very anti-Israeli regime took power that's still there. And there's no way Iran was going to keep supplying Israel with oil. So, you have a Soviet-friendly government takeover in Portugal, and then you have, if not necessarily a Soviet-friendly government takeover in Iran, it's certainly one that's hostile to the U.S. and Israel. So Israel ended up being even more isolated than ever over there by the end of the 70s. So, I look for the supposed glorious triumph of Kissinger in booting the Soviets out of the Middle East. And I go, where is it? I don't see it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it also sheds light on the idea that you talk about this cue ball of it's just America that's playing the playing pool, hitting the cue ball, that all other balls react. Clearly, there's other things that are happening there, but obviously, there's still America is still a great power there the whole time, and then the Soviets did not become one in the 90s, especially after their disastrous war in Afghanistan, which, again, the right-wing conservative tenant-paid media cynic would say, well, the Americans did a 20-year war in Afghanistan. So, what would you say to just some of those things? Just a little bit topical about how these are chat show points, talking points here, right? They're not really too deep in some of this history, but people are trying to wrap their heads around, what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East, or what the U.S. is doing supporting Israel, for example. It's hard sometimes to sift through it, and then maybe there are players like China involved. I mean, it's hard to know.
Yeah, right. Well, starting with Israel and then going to Afghanistan, just because they're one's earlier than the other chronologically. So the United States didn't really do all that much to support Israel until 1970. We recognized them in 1948, but their main allies and suppliers at the time were Britain and France. Certainly by the time of the Suez Crisis, that was basically a joint operation between Israel, France, and Britain. The United States' main involvement in there was to tell them all to stop when it looked like they were going to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt. Whether or not that was a good idea or not, it certainly shows that the United States was not on Israel's side no matter what at that time. By 1970, what happened was the PLO tried to overthrow the King of Jordan, and the theory was that Syria was going to support this by invading Jordan, but Israel was able to deter Syria from doing that, basically by threatening to strike Syria if they did it. And this allowed the Jordanian monarchy to defeat the PLO uprising and expel the PLO from Jordan entirely. Then they went to Lebanon. And the United States basically saw that and said, hey, look at that. Israel can actually be a force for stability in the Middle East. And we like stability. Stability über alles was sort of the motto of Nixon and Kissinger. And it has its advantages. So that's when we really started heavily supplying Israel as an ally for the first time. And that was a big deal for Israel because in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 1967, they got cut off by the French because the French were basically being blackmailed by all the Arab oil powers because France doesn't have any oil of its own. Britain, not as much, but I think Britain, was not as much of a factor for Israel. But we basically came in big time starting then, supporting Israel. So I wouldn't say we were calling the shots, but we were backing Israel's plays a lot after that. But we still played this sort of game where, it was a bit of a good cop, bad cop situation where Israel would be more aggressive with its enemies in the Middle East. And then when the Soviets would start threatening to come in, we would tell Israel, okay, no, you have to stop. And we tell the Soviets, okay, we're getting Israel to stop, so you can stay out. Moving on to the case of Afghanistan. So the thing there is that there's this enormous tendency to blame everything that goes wrong on the world on the United States getting involved. And we're very heavily involved in Afghanistan, and I won't go into that because it's a long story, but overall I would say it was a good thing. The really bad thing that we did over there is we stopped being involved. In the early 90s, we basically said, hey, look at this. The Cold War's over. We won. Mission accomplished. We don't have to bother with this country anymore. It's remote. It's poor. It's no threat to us. So, we'll just let whatever's going to happen over there. And that's when there was a power vacuum created that, other more local regional powers decided to get a lot more involved. The Russians never really left. They withdrew their conventional forces, but they still backed certain factions in Afghanistan. Pakistan had already been very involved with us during the 80s, but in the 90s, if anything, they got even more heavily involved. Pakistan basically created the Taliban. The Taliban didn't really exist before the 90s. They were recruited out of the Islamic madrasas in Pakistan on the other side of the border from Afghanistan in tribal territory. They were armed by Pakistan. They were funded by Pakistan. They were, essentially controlled by Pakistan. They took over Afghanistan, thanks to Pakistan, as well as they were recognized, I think, also by Qatar. I can't remember if they had any other countries' help either. They got a lot of their weapons from China still, so China was, helping them. So that, ended up with a truly, the sort of regime in power there that makes puritanical look like an understatement. I mean, they banned chess. They blew up these giant statues of Buddha at Bamiyan. They banned music at weddings. I struggle to convey just how anti-freedom the Taliban, were and still are. And that all happened because we stopped supporting anyone over there in Afghanistan that would have wanted any kind of freer, more liberal in the classical liberal sense of the word than that. And before the Soviets got involved, Afghanistan was not like that. It was a place where women didn't have to wear burqas. It was a place where women could go to school. They had a constitutional monarchy. I think I've even seen it. I know a guy on Twitter who's writing a book on the war in Afghanistan who points out that women got the right to vote in Afghanistan before every single canton in Switzerland granted women the right to vote. And that's, goes to show you that this type of, religious reactionary, terrorist, gender apartheid regime is not really indigenous to Afghanistan. It's not like they're reverting to type.
Was that spurred on by the Soviets, or what was the history there with the Soviets? You think it was related?
Absolutely, yes. So in the 1970s, the Soviets were sponsoring two communist political parties in Afghanistan. I can't remember their names right now. I think it's Parcham and Khalk. They have initials that I can't remember, abbreviations for their names, PDPA and something else. But basically, they were sort of like the maybe the Stalinists and the Trotskyists of Afghanistan. And they were both in the Afghan military. So the first thing that happened is in the early 70s, I believe 1973, the prime minister of Afghanistan, who's a guy named Daoud, decided to overthrow the monarchy and declare himself president of Afghanistan. And then shortly after, he got the same treatment by the communists in the Afghan military who were being, trained and sponsored by the Soviets. And then they discovered this problem that, lo and behold, the communist program in Afghanistan of, taking land away from all the big landlords and suppressing religion was not going over all that well with the people of Afghanistan. So an armed revolt started. And the big problem the Soviets had there was that their guys running Afghanistan were killing too many Afghanis too fast. And they were just provoking more and more revolt against them. So they said, this is bad. We have to do something about this. Hey, we've got a great idea. Let's send in the Soviet military and overthrow the guy that's currently running amok there, and we'll replace him with this other guy who's more to our liking. I think his name was Taraki was the guy that was overthrown, and Babrak Karmal was the one that the Soviets put in power. But Karmal was not really all that much better. I think a friend of mine used to listen to shortwave radio broadcasts about the war in Afghanistan, and he told me he remembers hearing one where Karmal was saying that they were going to build socialism in Afghanistan even if they had to kill 25% of the population to do it. So they were using chemical weapons in Afghanistan. I think it was called Yellow Rain. They were putting explosives into children's toys that they were distributing all over the place. So when the kids would say, hey, look, a toy, I want to play with it, they'd pick it up and it would explode and kill the children. They were doing truly horrible, horrible things over there. Both the Soviets and their, Afghan communist co-conspirators. And so, anyone that says that, Afghanistan would have been better off if we had, left them alone, I think is delusional.
I think it's very interesting to share some of these stories because that's the only picture that you really get, whether you're on the right or the left in the U.S. And obviously, everybody, we want everybody in the world to chart their own course, but when the choices between the liberal democratic West or whatever the despotic socialist communist East is throwing at you, you can usually see the results later on. But again, just to sort of steel man a little bit more, what about what Charlie Wilson said? He was doing a good job to take down the Soviets, and then he said we should have been involved more, maybe should have built more schools, more hospitals. Maybe that's not even steel manning. Maybe this is aligning right up with your point.
Yeah, I think it is really. I think Wilson was basically right about that. The other big part of it is that traditionally Afghanistan had a form of government based on a council of all the tribal elders, and they were going to have one of these grand councils to decide what their future was going to be for their country, but they needed our support, and we didn't support them. We let them basically, die and wither on the vine because we couldn't be bothered. We thought we didn't need them anymore, and we thought that, Afghanistan would not be a problem for us anymore. So again, Pakistan was happy to fill that void and help the Taliban take over. And I remember reading, one of the writers and journalists that's popular with a lot of paleo-libertarians is a guy named Eric Margoli. Eric Margoli was defending the Taliban at the time, saying the Taliban are great because they fight the communists and they're scaring the communists and pushing the communists out of Afghanistan. Well, it wasn't. The Taliban took over most of Afghanistan by 1994, and then by 1997, I believe, they were hosting Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda was marrying into the leadership of the Taliban. So they were, as joined at the hip as anybody could be over there. So, they clearly were a problem for us again within a few short years.
Right.
We let that happen. We didn't have to let that happen.
Right.
And it's another instance of inaction here is the whole reason why bin Laden went to Afghanistan is that he left Sudan because Sudan wanted to improve its image with the U.S. Sudan was being run by an Islamic dictatorship also. And Sudan actually offered to give us Osama bin Laden. And Bill Clinton at the time, as president, thought to himself, okay, if I take him, what do I do with him? I could put him on trial, but I don't really have all that much evidence against him yet. It's only 1996 at the time. and the trial could be a PR disaster, and might not go well. So Bill Clinton said no. No, I don't want him. So Suzanne said, well, okay, the U.S. doesn't want you, but we don't want you either, so you got to leave. Where do you want to go? And he said, okay, I'll go to Afghanistan. So they made Afghanistan his base and his staging area for the 9/11 attacks.
Well, let's keep it going then. I want to keep challenging you. And I mentioned this last time, and last time I was more focused fully on sort of Russia, Ukraine, which I do want to get to again this time.
Sure.
But a little bit more steel manning on, of course, what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 was not only going back into Afghanistan, but going into Iraq. And I mentioned this last time. I sent you the clip before the show, but so I found it. I had watched it at some point. I couldn't remember, but it was former head of MI5 Eliza Manningham Bueller and the former head of MI6 John Sawyers. And she mentioned it's a British show. The rest is politics, actually. And she mentioned how she thought that the connection that the Americans were making with Iraq and 9/11 was disgraceful. And that's a former head of MI5. She's saying this. And this is obviously with 20 years of hindsight. Maybe she was thinking differently at the time. Everybody was thinking differently at the time. Obviously, that was an extremely heated time. But these are the kind of things that, the Scott Hortons, or I imagine the Raimundos or Dave Smiths, they just run with. And, it is where we went. It is where we went obviously we're still there in some capacity. So, what do you think about views like that in the grand scheme of what happened with the Americans in the aftermath of 9/11?
Yeah, well, I would say I don't think it was the most direct connection in the world between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attacks, but I definitely think the connection was real. There was a recent review with 20 years hindsight by a guy named Kyle Orton, Orton. He's an analyst out of the UK, interestingly. So I'm going to cite him in response to your UK source here. And he had a fresh look at Stephen Cohen's book about the connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. And he said, as far as he can tell in hindsight, if anything, that the case for that connection has gotten stronger over time. So, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but not only was there a sighting of Mohammed Atta in Prague by Czech intelligence with a guy from the Iraqi embassy there, who basically was the Iraqi embassy's local senior intelligence officer for Saddam's secret police. And the Czechs have never backed off of that. The only argument that's been made to try and deny that meeting ever happened was the claim that supposedly Mohammed Atta's travel paperwork showed that he was in the U.S. at the time and he never left. But that doesn't mean he couldn't have left on, some other paperwork documents, and it just covered up his tracks. But oddly enough, ironically, this doesn't really prove anything. But I also have a friend who was taking flight lessons in Atlanta at the time, and he remembers one day witnessing an argument between an Arab guy at the counter for the flight school there and the person at the desk. And he recognized after 9/11 from the pictures that was Mohammed Atta.
Mm.
So you can see some strange, degrees of separation in the world when you start looking for them like that. So that's one connection. A lot of people don't realize this, but the bomber from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, who was still at large, was hiding out in Baghdad. His name escapes me at the moment. I think it was Abdul Basit, but I have to look that up to make sure I remember that correctly. Also, Abu Nidal was in Baghdad. They had played this game, Saddam and Gaddafi, sort of, musical chairs of who's hosting and sponsoring the Arab terrorists. Was it Saddam or was it Gaddafi? So at a point during the Iran-Iraq War, when Saddam wanted to improve his image with the U.S. and pretend he wasn't sponsoring terrorism anymore, he basically sent them all to Libya. So it was Gaddafi's turn. So that's where they spent most of the 80s. But they were traveling back and forth. Another instance of collaboration between these two regimes is that they were working together on their nuclear weapons program. And there's actually a book out about this now. It's got a great title. It's called Unclear Physics, about the way that Libya was hosting this nuclear weapons development program over there with some of Saddam Hussein's nuclear scientists. They were working on it. Now, the author of the book claims that they weren't getting anywhere and they never would have, and that may be true, but the point I make about that is they didn't really have to. All they had to do was make it look like they were working on an indigenous nuclear weapons program and then import nukes from North Korea, which is what Syria tried to do after, in the early 2000s. They had North Korea building a nuclear weapons factory in Syria, and Israel found out about it and ended up having to be the ones to hit it with an airstrike and take it out. So that could easily have been happening in Libya instead. And, perhaps nobody would have found out about it, or if they had found out about it, perhaps nobody would have had the guts to take it out. And so Libya could easily have developed a nuclear weapons program. That's one of the things you got to realize. As a result of us overthrowing Saddam, Gaddafi got scared and he gave up his entire nuclear weapons program, including his stockpile of uranium. And that's how we found out about the, international nuclear weapons smuggling network that was being run also with the participation of A.Q. Khan in Pakistan. And Pakistan also became a nuclear power thanks to A.Q. Khan. So, nuclear proliferation can happen. And I would argue that it would be a very big deal. If we had either Saddam or Gaddafi in the Middle East in power still today with nuclear weapons, I think that would be a lot worse for the whole world, including us.
So, continuing on the Steelman path, if there were these linkages and maybe there was enough predicate for war, where we still would have a hard time arguing that we've been very good at regime change or, in the aftermath. Libya and Iraq being two good examples of that. And so the argument against the wars in the first place tends to always go to, well, look, if it's worse after than before. It would have been better, at least there was stability, between Iran and Iraq when Saddam was there. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but the outcomes aren't always painting us in glory either. And so what's the counterpoint?
Right. Well, I think that's a lot easier to address Libya than Iraq. So I'll start with Libya because it's quicker, which is I don't agree at all that Libya is really all that much worse off afterwards than it would have been if Gaddafi had stayed in power. And my case study comparison, I wrote an article about this, there would be comparing Libya to Syria. Because Syria is a case where you had a Russian allied dictator stay in power. There was an uprising against him. We did not help overthrow him. And the result there is that Assad and Russia and Hezbollah and Iran have killed somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 Syrian people since then. And they're still at it. It hasn't stopped. It's been going on for more than 10 years now. And if you look at the actual death toll in Libya, it's much smaller than that. The fighting didn't last anywhere near as long. It's less than 50,000 that were killed. That's not great, obviously, but it's nowhere near as bad. And then for Iraq, the main thing I would say there is it's a combination of the United States, I think, deciding that after Vietnam, we never really wanted to fight counterinsurgency wars ever again. which I think was a bad decision. The only commander we had over there who really knew anything about how to fight a counterinsurgency war was Prowess, because he took a personal interest in it, studying the French experience in Algeria, essentially as a hobby on his own time, because he was interested in it. He was doing it right from the start when he was commanding the 101st Airborne in 2003, but he didn't get any support, and he wasn't allowed to take over until years later. Finally, when he did with the surge, they had to rewrite the combat manual for counterinsurgency from scratch because it hadn't been updated since, I believe, about 1940. And within short order, by 2011, we were at the point where even harsh critics of the war, like Biden, were saying, hey, it's over. We did it. We won. We can get out now. We can leave. It's done. Things were going well enough there that he felt like we didn't even need to have military presence over there. The other thing I would say about that is that usually when I look at figures for the casualty estimates for the Iraq war on the Iraqi side of things, there's a lot of bad research and exaggeration. I've seen casualty counts as high as 1 million. And I just don't think that's at all realistic. I think 200,000 casualties is a more realistic estimate. And of those, the vast majority of them were Iraqis killing other Iraqis, which again is bad. And if we could have prevented that, that would have been a good thing. But I don't think it's...
Do you have some good books on that? That's interesting. I mean, obviously I've heard the million figure as well, more often than not.
Yeah, I've been looking for good books on that. I don't think there really are any at this point. I've been referred to one that was published by the U.S. Army as basically a sort of a lessons learned study on its operations in Iraq. I haven't read it yet, and I think it's only available as a free download because nobody ever even bothered to publish it. There's just been this total lack of interest. I mean, I was even curious as to whether or not there'd been any sort of, articles written about, hey, let's look at the Iraq war 20 years after it started or 10 years after it supposedly ended. And there isn't really that much out there. It's sort of become the third rail of foreign policy discussion. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to touch it. There's this whole industry out there of... I saw a book with a good title for it called Industry of Lies, where, the critics of America just generate all of these bogus reports and studies just saying, everything America did was bad and, greatly exaggerating whatever statistic they can come up with about how bad, everything is that America's ever done.
Yeah, and this brings it back to the Russian propaganda, which is, my favorite hobby horse, and yours is pretty interested in it as well. It's boilerplate for them. It's absolutely boilerplate. You need to only just push out a few lies.
Yeah, there's one other point though that I want to make before we move on about Iraq,
Yep.
which is that it's another good example of what happens when the United States leaves. Things in Iraq were not that bad by 2011. They'd been through a lot, but it was basically at the point where the chiefs of the U.S. military thought that Iraq could be stabilized with a token military presence there of a few thousand troops. And it was time to renew the status of forces agreement that we had with the Iraqi government at that time. Obama was president. He put his vice president, Biden, in charge of negotiating that agreement. And basically, Biden didn't try very hard because he didn't want to. He never thought we should have been there by that point. I think he did support the invasion at first in 2003, but he soured on it soon afterwards. So without a status of forces agreement, we could not legally leave any troops there to stabilize the country and to give the Iraqi government some support against Iran. And then soon after 2011, we saw the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq. and then Syria. And they were being sent in. Some of it was indigenous. A lot of Saddam's intelligence officers joined the Islamic State. When that happens, I usually suspect that they've gotten orders from Moscow to do so. There was a huge number of volunteers that came in from Islamic parts of Russia, like Dagestan. Again, we even have testimony from the FSB saying, well, of course, we were sending people to the Islamic State. They were our informers. And I'm going, yeah, informers, right. You know, you're sending in volunteers because you want to cause trouble there. This is what happens when you leave a power vacuum behind. Someone's going to fill it. And usually the people filling it are people that are worse than the United States.
Well, and this is one of the things that I think people forget in the why is the U.S. meddling in Ukrainian affairs? What's the vital interest of the United States in Ukraine? We could veer off on that eventually. But the Russians were meddling in Afghanistan and Iraq as much as they possibly could for as long as they possibly could, sending weapons and intelligence and really kind of like running command and control operations in the background just because there were U.S. troops there that were targets. And some of the Afghan narrative, right, is that was, retribution for arming the Mujahideen. And, what that saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And there's some truth there. But, they would meddle with us at any opportunity they could. And they will continue to do so.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. Plus, a lot of the U.S. casualties in Iraq were to IEDs that were made in Iran by the Iranian Republican Guard Corps and sent in. The EFPs, especially, what do they call them, explosively formed penetrators. Those were the worst IEDs that we ran into there. So thanks, Iran. Syria certainly sent plenty of their people in to fight us in Iraq also. So basically the Sunni terrorists that we fought in Iraq were supported out of Syria, and the Shiites were supported out of Iran. And, after we've left, Iraq has basically become Iranian occupied territory, occupied by proxy. They've got these Shiite militia groups there, but that's who's running things now that we're no longer, in control.
Yeah, and so this goes back to a point you were making earlier that I would love to expand on, which is, so if you're the leader or the would-be leader of a country that is not a great power, and the non-interventionist view is everyone should just be left alone to do their thing. Well, if I was aspiring to lead a small country that didn't have its own strong military, I would immediately want to figure out who I could cozy up to for security, right? You need a big brother. And so we can not involve ourselves, but then that just means that the next best suitor is going to be approached if they're not going to reach out in the first place. And so the vacuum that you're talking about sometimes gets filled proactively by a country seeking sponsorship. And if it's not going to be sponsored by a Western liberal democracy, then we kind of know where it's going to go.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And so, for instance, there are other countries that I think do a better job of that over there, like Kuwait. This is a point that I think will get us over into a bit more of the whole Israel-Palestine question a bit, which is that, in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, not only was that invasion of Saddam supported by the PLO, but the Palestinians actually had an entire network of people working in Kuwait that basically helped out. They would come out to meet up with the Iraqi military and tell them, where to go to find the people they wanted to kill and the stuff they wanted to steal. And then after that, after the Gulf War, after we kicked the Iraqis out of Kuwait expelled all the Palestinians. They said, okay, we're done with you people. We've had it. We don't really need you, and we can't trust you because you helped Saddam, try to abolish our country. So get out. They kicked them all out. And I think one of the things this is relevant to is that today we do not see an ongoing terrorist campaign by the Palestinians against Kuwait. Here, this is supposed to be one of the major causes of Palestinian terrorism against Israel, that Israel supposedly, kicked them all out in 1948, and they didn't. But even if they had, there are all these other cases where Palestinians really were expelled. They were expelled from Saudi Arabia. They were expelled from Jordan, a lot of them. The PLO certainly was. And there's no ongoing terrorist campaign by Palestinians against those countries. So this is the kind of thing I bring up as an exception. There are all these theories about what causes terrorism, and that's supposed to be one of them. But there's all sorts of cases where it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think the challenge, and especially as we were alluding to at the top of the show, with so much just vitriol and clearly disinfo that not even the hosts can apparently discern while they're being victimized for receiving millions of dollars, as they all claimed, which was just hilarious. In unison, they claimed they were victims.
Yeah, they're being fed these prepackaged, prefab narratives that happen to support the point of view of Russia and its allies, and it happens to conflict with those of America and our allies. And they just adopt it wholesale, uncritically, without ever asking themselves, is this really true? Does this really square with the facts of reality? And I think that you really have to take an empirical approach to these things, like I was saying before, and say, what's the methodology here? Are they cherry picking their data? Are they only looking for cases that prove their theory? Are they really looking for cases that conflict with their theory and might disprove their theory?
Maybe that can lead us then to, talking about some of the modern stuff that's going on in the Middle East. What do you think about just the general view of Israel in the news with the current war in Gaza, and then, of course, now Hezbollah getting involved? We have many other conflicts you've mentioned, many of them that are started and funded by other entities, Syria, Ethiopia, Yemen, Sudan. Millions of people are dying, have died in these places than in Gaza, for example, which is obviously not an easy situation. But if you just take the example that happened last week with these pagers, or I guess over a week ago, perhaps, as of this recording, you really cannot imagine anything that could be more targeted of the enemy if we're going to use these sort of rules of engagement and rules of war. And, Israel still was never going to, no one's going to, if you're against Israel just by principle or whatever, no one is going to even admit that. And they haven't admitted if you've turned on any of the chat shows. They're just fighting such an uphill battle. But going back to the other conflicts that are going on, and I know that these are also pushed by Russia and China. What do you have to say about that in relation to the coverage that Israel has gotten in Gaza?
Well, I guess the main thing I would say there is that I think I was telling you this before the show. I think there's a very good analogy to be made between the strategy and tactics of militarist Japan in the World War II, the Pacific War, the Asia-Pacific War, where their whole strategy was basically based on trying to maximize casualties to the point where it would no longer be acceptable to Americans to continue the war. Now, in their case, the casualties they wanted to maximize were those of our military as we were invading Japan on the ground. And to that end, they had accurately predicted where we were going to invade and how. They had fortified those areas. They had built tunnel networks. They had trained children to be suicide bombers with IED backpacks. They had trained civilian militia of, I think, about 27 million people to attack us in human wave attacks, including with spears. It's a traditional Japanese women's weapon, the naginata, or spear. I read a account by a friend who lived in Japan for a while. He met a guy whose job it was to do the training with spears at the end of World War II in Japan. And he cried as he was telling my friend what it was like to be training their people, to be going up against our ground forces, with so little in the way of weapons. And the idea was that, they would force us to shoot children wearing backpacks approaching our positions on the fear that those backpacks would be rigged to explode when the children got near enough. And this would be a horrifying experience for our guys. We wouldn't want to do this. We don't want to kill children. Yeah. This is essentially what Israel is experiencing with Hamas in Gaza. There's a saying from Golda Meir that she was speaking for the Israelis, saying, we can forgive them for killing our children, but we will never forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. And this always reminds me, there was a song by Sting in the 80s called Russians, where there's a line in it saying, what will save us, me and you, is that the Russians love their children too.
Yep.
Well, the Gazans seem to love their children the most when they're getting killed by Israelis. They have child soldiers. They put them in uniform, they arm them, they send them out to draw fire. They hide behind them. They build their bunkers underneath hospitals and schools. And they bury these things as deeply as they can underground to protect them against bombing.
And what do you think about, again, it's sort of maybe a little bit macabre to put things in perspective with numbers and stuff, but when you have, what Russia did in Syria or what's happening in Sudan, you can't really say that this is like, these are wars of the U.S. is doing. Of course, there's going to be libertarians that are going to try to make that happen always in their argumentation. But what do you think about some of these other conflicts and civil wars that are happening right now that really just don't get nearly as much play as what's happening in Gaza? And then again, this has been said many times on the chat shows, but, the numbers are coming from the Hamas ministry. We all know that. And then, of course, there are going to be civilian deaths in there, but we also don't know how many of them are combatants. So, but again, you're talking about tens of thousands versus hundreds of thousands or millions in total for these other wars. So,
yeah, well, that's certainly a point that I think is well worth making. A lot of the victims of Assad and his allies in Syria are actually Palestinian refugees, but there doesn't seem to be any outcry about Assad killing Palestinians. Last I recall, the ongoing war with the most casualties and deaths in the world was the one in the Congo. I haven't checked in on it lately, but I think that death toll was probably up into the millions. There's, one of the things I love about the Israelis is they have a lot of slogans for these things. And one of them is that if there's no Jews, there's no news.
Right.
Right. So this goes back to, I think, a standard tactic that is used by a lot of these regimes, which is that they want to blame an external enemy for all of the internal failures of their own regimes. So they're scapegoating somebody for their failures, and it's an officially sanctioned target that you're allowed to scapegoat. And for a lot of these countries, that target is the Jews. You're allowed to blame the Jews. One of the things I thought was funny about reading this book about the demise of the Ottoman Empire is that there were all of these spontaneous revolts happening now that people saw an opportunity. It's like, hey, the Ottomans are gone. Now it's our turn to rise up and take over. And in all of these countries, there were usually two groups of people that ended up getting blamed for them, and one of them was always the Jews. The French would blame the British and the Jews, or the Russians and the Jews. The Russians would blame, the West and the Jews. The Germans would blame the Jews and somebody else, and even the British. in their parts of the country, they would blame stuff on the Jews too. There's this theory that Britain was this power pushing this completely, oppressive, dominating Western colonialist imperial agenda in the Middle East, and Israel is just the latest, advance man for this effort. The British were not particularly pro-Jewish overall right after World War I and before World War II. A lot of the British officials were anti-Semitic or neutral. Very few of them were actually pro-Jewish. Winston Churchill was one of them, and one of the generals over there was. But a lot of them were more sympathetic to the Arabs because the Arabs had a tradition of being rulers, like the British. Also, when the British took over India, they found that they liked the parts of India that were ruled by the Mughal Empire before them. The Mughals were Islamic because they were prudes. They were not into public displays of sexuality, and the Brits were Victorians. They felt the same way. There was an old joke, no sex, please. We're British. If you go to southern India, you can still see some surviving Hindu temples that are carved out of these enormous blocks of granite that weigh more than 10 tons. And a lot of those sculptures are sex acts being portrayed that are, highly pornographic, even by our standards today. Well, all of those Hindu temples in the parts of India that were conquered by the Mughals were destroyed. And think about how much effort it takes to destroy a sculpture that's been carved out of, 10 tons or more of granite.
Yeah,
they put a lot of effort and time into this. So with Israel, there's this notion that Israel is, the source of all trouble in the Middle East, if not the world. There's this hyper focus on anything that Israel ever does that harms anybody or is in the least bit wrong. And there's all this other news from the rest of the world that gets completely ignored.
Well, and there's a very convenient optic, which is Israeli fighter jet pilots with American F-35s and American F-15s bombing Gaza, bombing Beirut yesterday, right? And the kind of military-industrial alliance there it's just perfect fodder if you're on the other side looking to paint a picture, and they certainly do that. But I want to see what you think about Israel has been very, very successful against Hezbollah in the last month. Do you they've been successful in the past, but this is almost uncharacteristically successful. Do you attribute patience and methodical application of intelligence and surgical strikes, or are they wielding new intelligence capabilities, AI leverage? Is something else going on here?
That's hard for me to say if there's anything really new going on. I know that the pager operation, and that gave rise to another one of those wonderful joke phrases from the Israelis, where they put a twist on the phrase of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They described the pager operation as occurring from the liver to the knee. But they had to set up a front company a long time ago to arrange the contract to supply those pagers to Hezbollah. They had to figure out how to rig those pagers to blow up on command. They had to figure out a way to get everybody to stop using their cell phones in Hezbollah and switch over to their pagers instead, which they did by killing one of Hezbollah's leaders with a surgical strike. And they used his cell phone to target him to figure out where he was. So they responded to all that saying, hey, everybody, ditch your cell phones, go to pagers. And then if you think about it, they had to order all of those pagers to blow up all at the same time. Because if suddenly, a few Hezbollah guys' pagers suddenly started blowing up, they would have ditched their pagers too. So to me, this looks like an incredibly well thought out and planned operation. And I don't really see how new intelligence capabilities would help out with that all that much. I mean, it's possible. I don't really know. But, to me, this looks like something they've had in the works for a long time.
Fortunately, Tim, duty calls here on the East Coast. I'm very grateful for your attendance here. I look forward to the next conversation, and I'll catch the rest of the show where Matt's no doubt going to get into Ukraine and Russia later.
Of course.
I'll leave the recording on, guys.
All right, see you, Alec.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hope you're finding these videos creative and to the point when it comes to navigating the rough waters of the financial system. And I'm happy to share with you a platform that can do the same when it comes to getting a loan secured by your Bitcoin, and that is Debify. Debify is a non-custodial, Bitcoin-backed lending platform designed for people who want to borrow against their Bitcoin while maintaining full control. Debify offers institutional-grade liquidity through independent lenders, allowing for high-volume loans of up to 5 years. All transactions are secured by a unique multi-sig escrow system, ensuring that Bitcoin collateral remains safe and transparent. This setup guarantees that your Bitcoin is not rehypothecated, and you keep full visibility and control throughout the loan process. It's perfect for those who value security and transparency while exploring global stablecoin and fiat lending backed by Bitcoin. So head on over to debify.com today to get started. Yeah, and I think also in response to Alec's question, I think that this is a show of dominance as well. This is a show of a very purposeful show of supremacy and execution that you guys have been playing around, we've been tolerating and whatnot, but we can do more if you're going to keep messing around, basically, in so many words, right?
Yeah, one of my only complaints about a lot of these things is that I just wish the United States had done them 40 years ago. Hezbollah killed our people in Beirut in 1983 and 1984. They kidnapped and tortured and killed one of our ambassadors over there, and we never really did anything about it. We left it up to ultimately Israel to be the one to take out Hezbollah for us. And I think that's a shame. But there's another larger point here, which I think goes to the difference between democracies and dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, if they're not full dictatorships, which is that dictatorships operate at a very high level of military mobilization and preparedness in peacetime. So when it comes to wartime, they're already escalated pretty high within their maximum limits, whereas democracies don't do that. We operate at a very low level of military mobilization and preparedness in peacetime, and so we have a lot further than we can go up in wartime.
And I want to ask you about that in regards to Russia, of course, but let's hold off on that because it's still, I think, interesting and timely, of course, to keep talking about Israel. And it's very interesting how it's progressing there. Obviously, it's, again, people, if you turn on the chat shows in the West, it's just hysterical that Israel is just some bad faith actor when clearly, one side, this is, again, I saw this interview with Mehdi Hassan and Piers Morgan the other night, and Mehdi is trying to say, of course, he's a very good arguer about this. I wouldn't want to go up against him about all the history of Israel-Palestine. I think you could, but I'm not sure if I could. But regardless, he tries to make this point about how he is being consistent when he says that Russia should leave Ukraine, and he thinks that Israel should leave Gaza and the West Bank. And of course, Pierce was trying to say that this is, it's a bit more complicated than that. But there's a very simple response to this type of a claim in particular, and that it's clearly, and he did make this point, is that clearly we're talking about liberal democracies on the one side, and that is the case, in fact, with Israel and with Ukraine both. But their counter-belligerent in this fight is someone that has repeatedly and profusely, whether it be on state media or regular media, and in many places, chants, protests, both of them, Russia and these certain militia groups of the Palestinian side, or, I know that Hezbollah is not there as well, but if you want to lump them in, we're talking about, but in both cases, that belligerent side says that they want them wiped off the map. They don't believe that they're real people, that they should exist, this and that. And you just don't have that on the other side. You don't have that on Israel's side, and you don't have that on Ukraine's side. If Russia would leave Ukraine, the war would be over. So again, it's another point that I think is just so simple. Doesn't sell on the chat shows. They just want to yell at each other.
Right. I certainly would agree with you about that. And I would say a lot of it is that in the West, we learned a lot of lessons from World War II. And I think probably the biggest one is that we don't ever want to be like the Nazis. And there are different theories about what it means to be like the Nazis, but I don't think anyone in the West really wants to be like the Nazis in any plausible way. Whereas I would say that lesson not only was never really learned in either the Middle East, a lot of the Middle East, or even Russia, or their definition of it is so glaringly different as to be, nonsensical or non-recognizable. In the Middle East, you actually had a lot of continuity between the Nazis and the Arab regimes that took over after World War II. I was reading about Nasser in Egypt. Nasser had Nazi chemical weapons experts working on his chemical weapons program, which he used those chemical weapons when he got involved in the civil war in Yemen. In fact, I was reading, of all people, Hitler's former head of special operations, Otto Skorzeny, was also working as an advisor in Egypt at one time. And then the Israelis found him when he was living in Spain. And the Israelis blackmailed him into going back to Egypt and working for them over there. And what they wanted him to do was to cozy up to his old pals from Hitler's chemical weapons program and kill them. So he did. One of the other things, though, before that Skorzeny did over in Egypt was that he trained Yasser Arafat in commando operations. So there's this direct line of historical continuity and descent between the literal Nazis, the actual German Nazi party and military, and these Arab regimes that took over after World War II. Same thing in Syria. I think the guy there was a Nazi named Alois Brunner, went to work for the original Assad regime in Syria. Syria has a Nazi party to this day. It's called the Syrian National Socialist Party. Plus the Ba'athist parties that ended up taking power in Iraq and Syria were explicitly fascist parties modeled on the Nazis. So, these countries, this is the other thing I say about Israel with Gaza and the West Bank. So Israel didn't occupy Gaza and the West Bank until the Six-Day War in 1967. After 1967, Israel kept trying to swap land for peace with the other Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, etc., Lebanon. So Israel always expected that within a short amount of time, eventually one of these land for peace deals would be accepted by the Arabs. They never were, but because Israel never expected to be in control of that, the Gaza and the West Bank for so long, they never really denazified those places. They never really, took a strong hand with the opposition there, with the, genocidally anti-Semitic people there. And even then, for 20 years after that, there was no uprising against Israeli rule in Gaza or the West Bank. There was plenty of Arab terrorism against Israel elsewhere, but it wasn't happening in Gaza and the West Bank. That didn't start until 1987. That was the first Intifada.
Right.
So one of the things that I see in these debates about what Israel did wrong to the Palestinians, why the Palestinians supposedly hate Israel, is it's supposed to be Israeli occupation. Well, if this Israeli occupation is so bad, how come it took 20 years for the Gazans and the Palestinians of the West Bank to rise up against it?
Right.
And in fact, if you look at the other statistics about those places during that time period, the population growth of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank was one of the highest rates of population growth in the world. The economic growth of Gaza and the West Bank was one of the highest rates of economic growth in the world. So, I don't want to be occupied by Israel. I don't think anyone really does. And I don't think the Israelis even want to be occupiers. But as occupations go, it seems like it was far from being the worst one that ever happened to anyone.
It's manifested itself again since we've last spoken in what I viewed as just an absolutely loathsome interview, was Tucker Carlson bringing on this guy, Daryl Cooper, to talk about why Churchill was the baddie of World War II, worse than Hitler, worse than Stalin. Of course, he tried to say that there was nuance, and he put this thread after, which got community noted all over the place. But there's so much to say about this. I mean, first of all, I just want to let our listeners know at least my position on this stuff. I didn't even know who this guy was beforehand. Of course, I knew who Tucker was, and Tucker has just somehow, at some point during his career, did some about face where he, I think, I'm a little bit putting him up on the chair now, but I think that he is so regretful for the support that he did for America in some of the earlier wars, which again, this is going back to our discussion about Iraq, because he was just gung-ho, American patriot, this and that. And rather than maybe looking at the situation more nuanced, like you just have done, he's gone completely on the other side, off the rails, obviously, as we talked about, interviewed Putin. And like Alec just joked about, I mean, how unserious an interview this is when you go to a French retailer and say how wonderful it is. And we talked about this on the last show, how Russia actually doesn't export anything. And they even, he went to it. That was a French grocer. And then, of course, the typical wonderful, beautiful subways that Russia has. It's just like nothing totalitarian about that. In any event, I was so surprised to see this, and shows you how much of an underground following neo-Nazis have. But I don't know. Full disclosure, I don't know this Daryl Cooper guy. I haven't followed his interviews. I haven't followed his podcast. But the way that he spoke, and I listened to a couple of interviews since then. It's so egregious. It's so counterfactual, ahistorical. When he's saying things like, I've heard him on another show I was just listening to, he said, what we think happened in World War II, what we think happened. Like, this isn't the most documented war in the history of all wars. And he still wants to do his revisionism, which is clearly in the manner of anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi/German nostalgia sort of view. I don't know. He doesn't, he didn't go all the way out there to say that he was a Hitlerite, but he was pretty close, in my view, with his examples. So egregious that it gets on, Twitter, X, Musk's little pet project, just platform where he basically just vomits out whatever thought he has, and he loves it because he gets immediate, 100,000 likes immediately. He said that it was a great interview, so thought-provoking, and then he tried to backtrack it and say, actually, I'm glad that Community Notes corrected him on this point, this and that. I mean, it's just it's so egregious. It's not even news. It's not history. It's not real. It's not factual. And I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on where we are here, because people are starting to feel like it's okay to just be blatantly anti-Semitic. It's okay to make up history.
Yeah, I agree. It reminds me of this Monty Python sketch they did about the Nazis running for a local election in England in the 60s. And you had, I think it was John Cleese dressed up as Hitler at this podium in a town square there, ranting and raving and screaming and shouting and gesticulating in German. And then, tiny crowd of Britons standing there looking at him, wondering what the hell was going on and what he was saying. And then I think it was one of the other Pythons dressed up as Himmler, siding up to one of them and saying, "He's right, you know." And it seemed like Tucker was playing the part of the Himmler guy there, saying, "He's right, you know."
Oh God.
It's this sort
That's
of
a great
thing.
reference.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I love Monty Python, and I could probably quote them way more than anyone would ever want me to. But this is, I think, is another instance of people fumbling around looking for a narrative to explain the world as they see it, and stumbling upon this prepackaged narrative that is in some dustbin somewhere, or some abandoned file cabinet. They open up and they look inside and go, "Oh, hey, look at this. This makes sense." And they trot it out and they start talking about it, and it comes as a great shock and surprise to them that this narrative that they found, that they thought was this completely new or long lost thing, has actually been widely and thoroughly discredited decades ago for good reasons. And I watched an interview with Niall Ferguson on this, one of my favorite historians, who was commenting on it and saying, perhaps when you find yourself making the exact same arguments as the actual Nazis, you're doing it wrong.
Yep. The actual Holocaust deniers, the actual the David Irvings, the Harry Elmore Barnes.
Now, for Cooper himself, he has tweeted saying that he is a fascist. He has tweeted.
Has he?
Yeah.
He said that in a recent, after, post all this nonsense? When he got all the attention?
He's been trying to sort of sanitize his tweet history, but people have been finding them before he could get to them. He's come out and he praised Franco, which is a very common one. A lot of these uber Catholic traditionalists love Franco, and Franco after World War II was not so bad. He still was, a mass murdering dictator who had come to power via violence and killed a lot more people, but at least he prevented Spain from going fully communist. So there's something to be said for him there. I saw a very good interview about the Spanish Civil War.
He lost their gold to the Russians.
Yeah, oops. Spanish Republic sent it there. Paul Gottfried, one of the paleo-libertarian thinkers, said in this interview I saw about it that there really were no good guys in the Spanish Civil War. And I think that's accurate. So praising Franco to me is a big red flag. You see that a lot as people who, they don't actually want to be caught praising Hitler, but, Franco, they'll say, oh, Franco had his points, What else? He's also said that fascism is what happens when people see the communists ruining everything and they actually try to stop it, which I think is, again, not at all accurate historically, because
we could look at Italy post World War I.
Precisely. The fascists and communists collaborated as much as they ever fought each other. Yeah, and just presenting them as these diametrically opposed opposites like that is just completely inaccurate. Going more to it, I think Cooper's a good example of a lot of veterans of either the Iraq War or the War on Terror more generally, Afghanistan also, that are very demoralized because they went to war to fight for their country. They were very patriotic. They believed that they were doing the right thing. And ultimately, they feel like they lost in one way or another. They don't feel like the cause they were fighting for was really the right one. They don't feel like the country they came back to is the one that they thought they were fighting for. They think the country is, going the wrong way for them. And there's some truth to that. Ultimately, I am somewhat sympathetic to them for that. I think we do have some serious domestic problems in America that we have not been paying enough attention to and addressing as well as we could have. I just think trying to blame Churchill for it or trying to blame the Jews for it, which is what they always ultimately come down to. And Cooper even says in his interviews, Churchill was put into power by the Zionists that supported him in the London financial circles.
It's a good dog whistle right there.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not even really all that silent a dog whistle.
Sure.
It's like a glaring shriek alarm or something going, I'm a Nazi, I'm a Nazi.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're daring you to call them what they are. And one of the things I hate about the fact that people overuse the epithet of Nazi so much is that it's like the boy who cried wolf. When you call everything a wolf, then when it comes to an actual wolf and you cry wolf, people go, you always say that. You call everyone who disagrees with you a Nazi.
Well, this is precisely, and not to butt in here, but this is precisely what I think is happening in Ukraine. Russia really is the wolf.
Yes.
Russia even dog whistled back to you, dear right winger in the U.S., that they were just going to Ukraine to demilitarize and denazify it. Actually, which is precisely the most. If you want to get Freudian, that is the biggest projection possible. I mean, that is exactly what needs to be done to Russia. I mean, without compromise. You said it. They need to be demilitarized. They need to be denazified.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we live in a world now where they have the nukes. Russia, I think, will never be disavowed of her nukes. That is just there. That's a fact of life now. But what do you think about the fact that this is the second part of my question with Cooper and Russia? Like Cooper, of course, I haven't followed him enough to know his positions on Russia, Ukraine, but I know Tucker's, and he is very much, obviously, a pro-Putin, pro-Orban, anti-Western collaboration, free markets zealot. That is Tucker. Perhaps Cooper is right alongside there. Again, I don't know his views there. He said, at least in that interview, he's not a fan of Stalin. I'll give him that. He did say that. He's not going to have anything good to say about Stalin. He's correct on that in that viewpoint. What do you think about the fact that we just have all of these libertarians, right-wingers, Tucker Carlson types that are just completely falling head over heels now for Putin?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the main thing I would say about it is that the Russians are very good at pushing people's buttons and figuring out which buttons to push.
Yeah, that's the only thing they can do well.
There's this term called a concern troll. You know what that is? That's somebody who's basically trolling by pretending to be on your side, but then all they do is always talk about the negatives of your side. So, I'm for you, but I'm concerned about this. I ran into an example of this a few years back when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and I was following a Ukrainian libertarian named Roman Saskew, I think is how you pronounce his name. I can't remember. I don't know exactly. I don't speak Ukrainian.
Okay.
But, he's a good guy, and he was at Maidan also. And he's, been saying the right things about it. But I found myself having somebody, chiming in and supposedly, trying to ingratiate himself with me, saying, "Oh, I'm just like you, an American. I'm a veteran of the 101st Airborne, and the real problem is all these Jews running around Ukraine." And I just went, "Whoa, hold on there, pal. No, you're not just like me. I don't hate Jews. I am not, a wannabe genocidaire. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm not Jewish. Some people accuse me of being Jewish. I had an honorary Jewish grandfather, but that's it. My sister and I were adopted by these Jews that were friends with my mom who couldn't have children of their own. So they,
Certainly nothing to be ashamed about if you have that
yeah,
position,
right,
in my view.
exactly, yeah. He was, but yeah, these guys. How do I put it? They're desperate for an alternative, and a lot of them come into libertarianism via economics. And economic policy is probably the most well-developed body of thought in libertarianism. There's a whole Austrian school of economics.
Except for banking, of course.
I'm not saying they're completely correct about everything. I'm saying it's well-developed. There is a prepackaged narrative for them to consume and latch onto and hold on to. There's also the Chicago School of Economics for people that are, not as committed to the Austrian school. I tend to adhere to a sort of a combination of both, depending on exactly what the issue is. And they get a lot of things right that other mainstream economics schools do not. So I think, they deserve a lot of credit for that and a lot of respect. But I think a lot of the people that come into this via economics, they look around for other areas of policy and they don't really find as much. And sometimes what you do find is very similar to what you hear from the left wing of the conventional political spectrum. And if you're not really all that enamored of the left wing, if you have some serious issues with the left wing, I think there are some serious problems with the left, then they'll get alienated by that and they go looking around for an alternative. And one of the most common ones they find is from these right-wing social conservatives who often are not really all that sympathetic to free markets at all. And then frequently they ultimately resort in this sort of uber religious, uber traditionalist social worldview where they resort to saying we all need to be just go back to Christianity, back to God, and anybody who's not Christian is bad. And probably the group of people around us in the world that's been conspicuously not Christian for the longest period of time is the Jews. And the Jews are basically, no, thank you. We've already got our religion. We're not going to push it on you, but we're not giving it up either.
Yep.
And that, that brings about a conflict. If you think that, the way to heal the conflicts in our society is to have a unified religion, then what do you do with the people that don't agree with your religion? I heard it once said that there are basically three theories of social order. One theory is essentially that the thing that ties a society together is religion or ideology. Another is that the thing that ties a society together is the state or force. And the third option is the division of labor. And, that's the one that Ludwig von Mises proposed. That's essentially the one that Voltaire was talking about when he was praising the tolerance of the London stock market. Hey, look, you have Christians and Jews trading with each other peacefully because it's to their mutual benefit. That's the one that I think we need to be touting and promoting and pushing. But a lot of people just don't see that. And they see a lot of things that happen in society that are, inexplicable to them or alienating to them. And so they take refuge in this ideological theory. The problem is that we need a unifying ideology to unite us all as a society.
Let's take two of those. First, lay on the religion. I think you're spot on. And I think that we have a very dangerous time now in that there are so many fundamentalist views that are merging with this, the second thing that you mentioned, which is the state. And that actually, if you want to extrapolate and go meta, we can even bring up the third thing, which is like a lot of the Mises people, they claim, say that they're anarcho-capitalists and they don't want to involve the state in anything and whatever. And I think that's, fine. It's a good view. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. I'm sure of it. We can say that we always want to move toward liberty. That's great. Let's do it. Let's try. I just can't see a libertarian sort of utopia ever emerging from a world where, like, I would love to have 8 billion sovereign flags, but we have a world where nukes exist. We have a world where borders exist and they are infringed upon, mostly by authoritarian countries. The point is, we have this. We're trying to keep this fabric of society going in this world order that has really been established since the end of this greatly studied World War II. Do you think that is, on the brink, or is there something that's going to change in the next few years, or do you think that people will get their wits about them and sort of go back to something that understands that, okay, we can have these rights and liberties and things, but it has to be in the confines, at least, of, respecting laws and the state?
I think what I would say is that what we're seeing is an overall conflict in the world between countries where there is some separation of religion and state or ideology and state, and countries where there really isn't any such separation. So I would put the West on the side of separation of church and state, and I would put Israel on the side of separation of religion and state. A lot of the other countries that are against us, Russia doesn't have separation of church and state, never really did. They tried banning religion for a while, but they soon gave up on that, and they decided to bring it back in service of the state again.
And just to remind, we might have talked about this last time, but just to remind our listeners, I mean, the Orthodox Church is fully an agent of the Russian government. I mean, there is no separation at all.
Yeah, it was a branch of the KGB, essentially, and now it's a part of the FSB. Same thing, Iran is an Islamic republic. Pakistan is an Islamic republic. I take your point about, Israel's neighbors being ethno-states. One of the little-known facts about the aftermath of the Israeli War of Independence in 1948 is that every Arab country in the world expelled all their Jews.
Yeah.
And a lot of them went to Israel. It was hundreds of thousands of them.
Yeah.
600,000 or 700,000 of them, last I heard. And again, if you believe that that's the sort of thing that causes terrorism, then you have to explain how come there's been no Israeli terrorist campaign against any of those Arab countries, from Morocco to Iraq. It just hasn't happened. One of the biggest expulsions of people ever was the 15 million Germans that were expelled from Eastern Europe after World War II. And about 10% of them are estimated to have died in the process. So that's 1.5 million people. That's a lot of people. And there's no terrorist campaign by Germans against any of the countries that expelled them. There's some lawsuits by Germans trying to recover property that they lost in some of those countries, but that's fine. They may have some merit. If they do, I hope they win. But no terrorism.
It was Russian done, obviously. I mean, it's a Soviet Union thing. Another gift from the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Stalin decided, hey, Poland, we're going to take some territory from your east. And Poland said, hey, what about us? And they said, oh, it's okay. I'll give you some part of German territory on your western border. Oh, okay, that's fine then. Not like they really had a choice. Of course, they didn't. They had to do whatever they were told by Stalin. But Czechoslovakia expelled about 3 million Germans after the war, before it was fully Sovietized. So they weren't completely under Stalin's compulsion yet.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Yeah,
true.
the Beneš decrees. President Beneš, who'd been the president of Czechoslovakia in exile, came back, and his argument was basically, these German people were used as an excuse to invade us, and that was terrible. We don't want it to happen again. So we're going to try it the other way. Perhaps not a good idea or the best idea in the world, but I would say somewhat understandable. But I think you definitely could say that those people who were expelled had legitimate grievances that could be redressed. But thank God they're not committing terrorism to try and bring that about. Bringing it back to the larger question, I'm hopeful that we're seeing Israel take out some of these long-standing threats and problems that they and the rest of us have all been putting up with for decades. The big one that's still there and hasn't really been dealt with is Iran. I don't know what they're going to do. I did just recently read an interesting article pointing out that Hezbollah was basically Iran's second strike capability to retaliate against anyone who tried to hit Iran and presumably take out Iran's nuclear program, but attack Iran in some other way also.
I heard that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you take out their second strike capability, then that clears the way for a hit on Iran. So maybe that will happen. I don't know. I was reading about the Israeli strike on the Syrian nuclear program back in 2007. And what's interesting about that was that Israel came to the U.S. and told us about it. And they told President Bush, we want your help to deal with this. What can we do? How can we cooperate on this? And the U.S. basically said, no, sorry, we're busy. We don't want to deal with it. So the Israelis took it out on their own because they felt like they had to. So Israel is committed to taking this type of unilateral action on their own. They feel like
as is Ukraine, by the way. I mean, that's what they did with the Kursk invasion, incursion.
They've hit
SMO.
They hit this huge ammo dump that was pre-positioned close to NATO's borders.
Yeah,
that probably would have been used to support a Russian invasion of the Baltics, if not the rest of NATO. So thank Ukraine for doing that. One of the overall points here, I think, is that a lot of American libertarians like to pretend that these other dictatorial, authoritarian countries are only threats to their immediate neighbors and not the rest of them.
Or their immediate populace. Like, they're the ones that actually don't intervene at all.
Yeah, right.
It's only America.
Exactly. And whereas, in fact, what we see in practice is that they're threats to everyone. So Iran, for instance, blew up a Jewish community center in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, back in the early 80s. I guarantee you Argentina has never done anything to Iran. So where's the pretext for Iranian terrorism against Argentina? There just isn't any. That, and the other thing here is that a lot of the countries that these people cite as supposed models for us to follow of neutrality, like Switzerland, actually have been the victim of terrorism. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, blew up jets in Geneva airport just because they were going to fly to Israel. And in response, Switzerland basically said they engaged in appeasement. They said, okay, what we'll do, here's what we'll do. We'll let you use our banking system. So all these Islamic terrorist groups get to use Swiss banks in exchange for not targeting Switzerland. That's not non-intervention. That's intervening, helping out one side. That's taking sides.
Yeah.
Same thing. There was a case where Obama...
Same thing with Russia.
Yeah, and Obama let Hezbollah get away with money laundering via HSBC, the Chinese-owned bank. They basically gave HSBC a slap on the wrist. Said, "Oop, naughty, naughty! Don't do that. No money laundering for terrorists." Like they think that's something that banks would need to be told.
Right.
So overall, I'm hopeful that we'll see some progress here. A lot of what's been going on, I think, has been the result of basically the U.S. doing nothing. We've had the Houthis attacking the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea for a long time now, and
Right.
we've basically been shooting down their missiles as they approach our ships, but not striking back. Israel just took out the main port in Yemen. That shows that it can be done. I don't know why we weren't doing that, except that the president we have now doesn't want us to do that. So we need a house cleaning. We need a new broom, a new regime to take over and try to do things better. Hopefully that will happen. I don't know if it will or not. It's hard to say. I think there's a few things that Trump did right last time, and there's a lot of things he didn't do or didn't get right last time. Maybe he'll do better if he gets another chance. But ultimately, I think that's a lot of what it comes down to is our leaders have to do a better job.
Still keeping it on more of the meta stuff. Do you see that? Do you see smaller states persevering in the next, the next 50 years, and a few larger states because of nuclear deterrence or nuclear containment? That's kind of what we've tried to have done since World War II, basically. Or do you see more states getting nukes out of fear of mismanagement from the large countries? Maybe we wish it was companies, right? From the large countries, and more smaller states get nukes, and then we have thus more smaller states. I'm not necessarily sure that it's one or the other, and it's all dependent on nukes, but I think nukes is like the big picture here, clearly. Like, I know Poland's worried. I know Ukraine would be got to be working on something. Whether they're not going to wait for Washington to try to get some preparations for themselves. I mean, I have no firsthand knowledge of these things, but I mean, Poland has already asked the U.S. to bring in more nukes, and if they're not going to get it, what would that stop Poland from trying to do it themselves?
Well, and we have them in other countries. We still have some in Turkey, as I understand it. So why not Poland? I basically view nuclear proliferation as an inevitability. I am somewhat of an advocate of it, actually. For instance, I thought that instead of handing over Hong Kong to China back in '97, that we should have sold nukes to Taiwan and Hong Kong and South Korea. We did officially withdraw our ground-based nukes from South Korea, but we basically replaced them with ones based on submarines. So that's not really a huge downgrade in terms of capability over there.
Right.
But I think, the whole attempt at stopping nuclear proliferation suffers from the same problems as any other types of gun control or arms control, namely that the people that you want to obey those laws are the ones that won't.
It's very difficult at a state level because we see that it's difficult on a national level, and that's a very good point. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, and we saw, with other types of weapons of mass destruction, so biological weapons were banned by treaty. The Soviet Union signed the treaty and then proceeded to develop the largest biological weapons capability the world had ever seen because they thought it gave them a strategic advantage over the West. China has been actively pursuing biological weapons also. And I think that it's pretty clear that the whole COVID-19 pandemic was an inadvertent byproduct of China's biological weapons development program. They were running experiments and they had a lab leak. And thanks, China, we all got subjected to your the results of your biological weapons program.
And then it was shameful. I mean, this has been disproven many times, and still probably the right wing nutsos believe it. But the supposed bio leaks from Ukraine,
yeah,
U.S. labs in Ukraine. This was absolutely all Russian disinfo, Chinese disinfo, that they're trying to prove these things in the wake of the disaster that they caused. It's just nonstop. It's it's very difficult to.
Oh yeah, and the only reason there were any biological weapons lab in Ukraine ever in the first place is because the Soviets put them there.
Right.
They needed to do it in a place where they had people who were well educated enough to actually do biological research like that. Well, Ukraine's got more educated people than a lot of Russia did. So that's where you put that. That's where they put their equivalent to the Top Gun fighter school. That's where a lot of their nuclear scientists were from. I think I may have told you we had a Russian Jewish nuclear scientist and his wife living in my house in California when I was growing up, renting a room from us that had come over here. Working at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, we were told he was a geologist. Well, he was actually a nuclear scientist. We brought him over here to work for us so that he wouldn't be forced to go work for evil people who would pay him to develop radioactive weapons for them.
Right. Right.
Same thing with chemical weapons. Chemical weapons have been called the poor man's nuke. And we've seen a lot more chemical weapons proliferation than we have nuclear weapons, mainly because the technological barriers are not as high. It's easier to make chemical weapons. And again, a lot of that development was done by the Germans pre-World War I. After World War I, there was a lot of collaboration between the Germans and the Russians in chemical weapons development. That's how Russia got its chemical weapons program in the first place. Later on, Saddam got his chemical weapons program from Germany. That's one of those things that gets blamed on the U.S. We gave him a few pesticides that he said he needed for agricultural research and some vaccines. Well, he got a hell of a lot more from the Germans, and he got a lot of technical assistance from the Russians, who actually knew how to make these things, because he sure as hell didn't.
Right.
This is one of the other big questions. I hope I'm not interrupting you here. Is about Russia, which is they have this nuclear stockpile, but how operable is it? These things expire. They have to be maintained. They have to be renewed. They have to be refreshed. We have no idea how well any of that's been done over there. For all we know, they could be, looking at massive failures if they ever tried to do any kind of nuclear launch against us. And supposedly, we are now telling the Russians that if it looks like they're going to do this, we can take out every single nuclear launch site they have with airstrikes.
Yeah, and that's a good response. Obviously, it's not a gamble in general. The first part that they wouldn't work, that anybody wants to take, right? But I think you're right, and I've heard that expressed many times from many different people on the subject. But what I was going to say earlier is just about the end game isn't the right word, but just dealing with unregistered guns or something in the U.S., right? Let's take the case of North Korea, right? We know that this is just an odd, weird case. It's just some weird family dynasty that everybody's afraid of. We basically pay them. We give them food. We pay them not to nuke us. That's what it's come down to. In the case of North Korea, it's like we have nukes, they do, and it's just the most bizarre thing.
Yeah, well, we were supposedly paying them not to develop nuclear weapons. Clinton brokered this deal with them in 1994, where we were going to give massive aid to them along with South Korea and Japan. And North Korea's part of the deal was that they were supposed to not develop nuclear weapons. Well, they took the aid and they developed nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
one of the books I read recently was by a guy who wrote, started off in nuclear strategy. So he made the point that the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is considered to be one of the most successful international treaties ever. But the way he said it was successful is that the people that do sign it don't proliferate, and the people that do proliferate don't sign it.
Yeah,
So,
precisely.
Okay, Israel hasn't signed it, and I don't think they should, because I think they need to have a nuclear deterrent. They maintain a policy of nuclear ambiguity, where they neither confirm nor deny that they have one. I think they probably do. I think everybody probably knows they do. But what do we do about countries like North Korea? There, what I would say is that North Korea is clearly playing the part of the bad cop to China's supposed good cop. It's a proxy of China. And if we want to influence North Korea, we have to do it really by way of China. We've got to apply pressure to China a lot more than we ever really have. And, whether or not we're going to do that is an open question. We've been harder on China since 2016 than we were before. Even Biden has continued being somewhat hard on China with, restricting China's ability to access our advanced semiconductor industry. I think that's a good thing. I would like us to do a lot more there. How about a rule saying we won't pay for any biological research in any country known to have a biological weapons program? That would rule out China. I think that would be a good idea.
And how do you feel about, and you mentioned we have this sort of three ways that the fabric of society could operate under, and of course they're not mutually exclusive, but we have the state, and we have religion, and then we have, of course, the market. This anarcho-capitalist view that kind of keeps coming back in, like, I enjoy a lot of the different theories. The most persuasive one to me has been David Friedman, actually, his sort of gradualist approach, where it's see what we can do without the government and then gradually remove. I think that's very nice. But again, even if I watched David Friedman, I watched some of the videos that he gets and the views. My YouTube channel just started last year. I'm not doing too gangbusters myself, but these ideas are they're like in Pluto, they're so far out there that I just don't see them making their way into the mainstream. So is it more interesting just to kind of settle on history, we have the state, we have things like nukes, we deal with that? Or do you have some lingering interest still in this sort of anarcho-capitalist ideal?
I'm certainly interested. I think there's some things that a lot of anarcho-capitalists get wrong, but I think there's a lot of validity to it as well, mainly as a conceptual tool for analysis, as well as a bit of an ideal to compare the real world to and see how well it approximates that ideal. But the main thing I would say is the biggest flaw that I see in a lot of anarcho-capitalists is they seem to think that you can simply do away with the state and not have anything that performs the same functions in a similar way to what the state does now. For instance, when it comes to aid for Ukraine, a lot of them will say, oh, I'm against any tax-funded government aid to Ukraine, but I'm perfectly okay with private voluntary funding. So why are you against the tax funding? And one of the arguments they will make is that, well, it could cause Russia to retaliate against us. Well, okay, fine. But, if we suddenly had, tens of millions of dollars of private funding going from America to Ukraine instead of government funded stuff, why wouldn't Russia retaliate against us for that? So the more you want to try and replace these state functions with things that are done on a voluntary basis, the more you're replicating, almost everything that the state does. Hopefully, it'll be better, it'll be more efficient, it'll be, better quality, etc. It won't do things that are unjust. It'll only do things that are just. But to some extent, you're reproducing some of what we already have now.
Do you find any improvement in? This is a cheeky question that I don't disagree with you and everything that you just said, but do you find any government program that has improved over the years? Military, I guess.
Well, what I would say about that is that competition generally is what I see leading to improvement in any aspect of life. And I think there definitely has been improvement in military operational, efficiency and effectiveness and capability thanks to competition over the years. I think that's one of the only reasons why the Soviets and then the Russians were able to field any equipment that was any good at all. At times, they've had stuff that was better than ours.
Stole it too, obviously.
Oh yeah, they'll get it wherever they can. They'll steal it. They'll lie. They'll cheat. They'll bribe. They'll corrupt. They'll do whatever they have to. And they
that book that you mentioned about the Cold War.
At the Abyss.
Yeah, I'll link it in the show notes. Read that after you mentioned it in our last interview, and that was fantastic. And one of the almost just hilarious points was that it was declassified, and the nuclear scientists, after the wall fell and after the Cold War, they learned that when they went back over there, that the first iterations of their bomb was like literally, it was nothing changed. I mean, it's 100% our plans. And they're like, we didn't want to, it was death penalty for us if we, of course, these weren't the original ones. These were, descendants, and right. This is in the 90s, but they didn't want to tweak anything because for them, they would probably be dead from Stalin and then Khrushchev. So they just literally point by point, every single thing was exactly the same from those first iterations.
Because they knew it worked. They wanted to go with something they were sure would absolutely work. It was guaranteed to work. We had already proven that it worked. So why, risk something that was unproven when, Stalin was watching over you?
Yeah.
It has to work. It better work. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But other examples. So, for instance, I watched a video about the history of the development of the F-16 fighter jet. And it was actually motivated by a Soviet fighter. I can't remember the name of it right now. But so what we thought was that this fighter was going to be faster and more maneuverable than anything we had. So we had a panic, and the Air Force said, we need to do some R&D. We need to come up with an even faster and more maneuverable fighter jet than, what we think they're developing. They ended up developing the F-16, and it worked quite well. It's very fast, very maneuverable. It's eventually become obsolete, but it's still a very good fighter jet in a lot of ways. And then we found out that the Soviet fighter jet was actually just a long-range fighter bomber. It had really big engines, so it could go really fast. It had a long range, but it wasn't very maneuverable because it was real heavy. So its only job was to, fly towards us as fast as it possibly could and then drop a nuke and then turn around and fly back home.
And that was the original impetus, huh?
Yeah, that was the motivation for the F-16, which turned out to be one of the best air-to-air combat fighters ever. And in Lebanon in the 80s, the Israelis flew them up against the supposedly equivalent Soviet MiGs of the time, and they wiped out the entire Syrian MiG Air Force fleet so badly that it's known as the Bekaa Valley Turkey Shoot. Virtually the entire Syrian Air Force was wiped out, and the Israelis hardly lost anything.
Yeah. So it helps to be prepared.
Yeah, but to me, that's an example of how competition does spur progress, technologically, also economically, And ultimately, this is what I put my hopes in. We need to have enough pluralism and competition in our societies between, a lot of, a whole lot of different parts of our societies, uh, between different levels of government, between different governments. One of the ways that I find anarcho-capitalism the most relevant today is that uh, we have international anarchy today. This is a well-known concept in
Right.
international relations theory. It's well accepted. Nobody disputes it. Nobody in international relations says, "Oh, anarchy is impossible. It can't possibly happen ever." They go, "No, we have it. That's
Right.
what we have, for good or bad.
Right.
It's good in some ways. It's bad in some ways." But you literally can't understand international relations without it.
It does go to show how the development of the nation state, took a long time, took a century, it took, millennia. Obviously, it's changed a lot. It sounds a little bit Marxian, right? To say that there's something like utopian after this. I don't think that there. I certainly don't think it's going to happen. Like I said, in my lifetime, I just don't see it. And so I've pulled back a lot on that. And like I said, for me, it was 2014.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a hollowness that rings, especially if you're going to be one of these libertarians that just likes to denigrate Ukraine because you can blame the U.S. And I've told you, it's the same people you've mentioned and you've seen, like the Scott Hortons or Raimondos or Dave Smith. One of the things I've heard him say and others about the Ukraine war was just because they hear what's happening with the Orthodox Church there, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Kirill Patriarchy, the KGB Patriarchy. Of course, they don't mention that part of the story. They're like, obviously Ukraine is just, it's closing down all these Russian churches, no freedom of religion there, this and that, like denigrating a country that is at war with a neighbor that is literally trying to annihilate them. And this church that you are supposedly, it goes back to your, what you're trolling goodwill there comment earlier. This little church that you're supposedly feeling sorry for, that their rights aren't being upheld, it's just a branch of the KGB. And these are the type of comments that, this sort of intellectual prowess of the flag bearers of the libertarian movement today just does not impress me. If you're just going to make these comments again and again, and either you don't know the full situation, or again, you're just concern trolling in this effort to make some bigger point. But it's very sad.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a lack of historical perspective there also. For instance, I don't think hardly anyone would claim that Britain was not a democracy during World War II. And yet, Churchill was not elected. He was brought in because Chamberlain stepped down, and he was the only person that could unite the parties in Parliament to be prime minister.
Another thing that Cooper got wrong during that interview.
Oh, yeah, I know, exactly. He thought Churchill was in charge right from the start. It's a
Unbelievable.
complete bonehead step on your dick.
It's one of the most basic things about World War II.
Yeah, precisely, exactly. Like, he never saw The Darkest Hour, which is a great movie that everyone should watch.
Yeah.
And there were no elections held in Britain for the duration of the war. And yet no one would rightly claim that Britain was not a democracy. It had problems.
Right.
It had censorship. Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists, was locked up, as I recall, and rightly so. If you have somebody openly, supporting the other side in a war, you're at total war with a mortal enemy like that's bombing your country, maybe you ought to lock him up. Luckily he wasn't killed or anything, but there's this complete lack of historical perspective, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that the World War II generation is mostly gone now. The people who went through it and remember it and fought it aren't here to remind us of any of these things anymore. But they left us, a lot of books, testimony, records, documentaries. People could educate themselves about this stuff a hell of a lot better than they do.
Yeah.
Andrew Roberts has written some wonderful stuff about World War II and Churchill that I would single out for praise.
Yep.
And he's done a great job of debunking Daryl Cooper also. Just one of those things where, in fact, he actually challenged Cooper. He didn't directly challenge Cooper to a debate. A British TV show invited him on to debate with Roberts. And
I heard.
Cooper basically turned him down, saying, oh, wow, Roberts is one of my heroes. I love his book on Napoleon, and I'm not really prepared to, defend myself in a debate against him. And I think, this should sort of clue you in that you really should keep your mouth shut until you feel like you are prepared to debate somebody like that.
And meanwhile, Dave Smith, Libertarian flag bearer, he called him one of America's treasures, basically.
Right.
And, it's just the cognitive dissonance just continues to amaze.
Yeah. So, going back to your overall question, I think, as long as we have, a lot of healthy competition going on, ultimately, I think we'll be fine in one way or another. But I just don't think history is predictable in any sort of way similar to, like the natural sciences, like physics or biology. Social science is just not that predictable in that way. The stock market is not that predictable. The economy is not that predictable. I just don't think we can say a whole lot more about it than that.
Well, what do you think, Tim? Going on 3 hours here. Anything else on your mind?
I think we covered most of the territory that I thought I wanted to.
Well, I think we should continue this because I really enjoy your book recommendations. And like I said, we'll link to those in the show notes as well as Tim's articles on Liberpedia. I think that your perspective is very helpful, drawing on the history that you know. And like you said, we don't have some of the greatest generation there to remind us of these things. And things seem like they're only going to get crazier in the fourth quarter. So let's see how it goes with the election. And let's speak again in a couple months, Tim.
I would be very happy to come back. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, always a joy talking with you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.